The stagecoach wheels screamed to a stop, kicking up a cloud of Wyoming dust that tasted like the end of the world. And for Eleanor Green, it might as well have been. She stepped down onto the rough wooden platform of Copper Valley, her city boots instantly coated in a fine layer of grit. It was 1878. She'd come 1,000 miles from Philadelphia, a journey that had stripped away every piece of the life she once knew. Every eye in the dusty street turned to her. Conversations died in the dry air. A black woman, dressed in fine traveling clothes, stepping off a stagecoach alone. It was a sight so strange it stopped the town cold. She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin, and refused to let them see the terror churning in her gut. Then a shadow fell over her, a shadow so big it blocked out the sun. She looked up and up, into the face of a man built like a mountain. Malcolm Everett. He had to be close to 7 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn work shirt. His hands, weathered and calloused, looked big enough to snap her in two. The townsfolk, who had been staring at her, now took a half step back from him. Even the stagecoach driver seemed in a hurry to unload her things and get the hell out of town. Malcolm's voice wasn't a voice. It was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. "Miss Green." She could only nod, her own voice trapped in her throat. He reached for her small traveling bag, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man his size. "Welcome to Copper Valley." The ride to his ranch was a study in silence. Ellie sat on the wagon bench, clutching a worn leather satchel on her lap. The bag was small, but it felt heavy. Heavy with the secrets that had driven her all the way out here. Outside the wagon, the world was vast and empty. Grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken only by the jagged teeth of distant mountains. It was a land that didn't care if you lived or died. Malcolm's ranch house appeared suddenly, a lonely wooden box against the enormous sky. It was simple, but clean. But as they got closer, Ellie noticed something was wrong. The porch railing was too low. The front steps were too short, clearly not built for a man of his staggering height. Inside, it was even stranger. Kitchen shelves were hung at a height she could easily reach. A small footstool sat next to the wash basin. A low-slung chair was placed by the hearth. He had rebuilt his world for someone small, for her. "I wasn't sure what you'd need," he rumbled, watching her take it all in. Before she could even process the thought, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Through the window, she saw 3 women on horseback, riding toward the house like an invading army. Agnes Brickwood swung down from her horse first. Her gray hair was scraped back into a severe bun, and her face was pinched with a sour disapproval that seemed permanent. She was the self-appointed queen of Copper Valley, the guardian of its so-called standards. She didn't knock. She swept into the house, her 2 companions trailing behind her like vultures. They formed a semicircle around Ellie, their eyes crawling over her, judging every inch of her. "We've come to meet your arrangement," Mrs. Brickwood announced, the word dripping with venom. "How interesting," she said, her eyes flicking from Ellie's dark skin to Malcolm's towering frame. "And where did you say you were from, dear?" "Philadelphia," Ellie replied, her voice steady. "And what did you do there?" "I was a seamstress." The 3 women exchanged a look loaded with 1,000 unspoken words. One of them whispered something behind a gloved hand, followed by a cruel little titter. "Well," Mrs. Brickwood continued, her smile as sharp as broken glass, "the frontier is a harsh place. The work is hard. The isolation, it can break people." Her eyes bored into Ellie. Many arrangements like this proved to be temporary. Malcolm's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Ellie will do just fine," he said, his voice a low warning. "Oh, I'm sure she will," Mrs. Brickwood purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure you'll both discover exactly how well suited you are to this situation." And with that, they turned and swept out of the house, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. The quiet that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Malcolm busied himself making a simple dinner. Ellie walked through her new home, touching the low shelves, seeing the footstools, feeling the weight of this giant stranger's attempts to welcome her. Then another horse approached. This time it was just one man, Sheriff Luke Matz. He was older, in his 40s, and moved with a calm authority that the land itself seemed to respect. "Evening, Malcolm, ma'am." He tipped his hat to Ellie. "Just wanted to stop by and offer a proper welcome." His voice was friendly, but his eyes were sharp. "Appreciate that, Sheriff," Malcolm said. "Things can get complicated out here," the sheriff said, his gaze lingering on Ellie for a moment. "Just wanted you both to know, my door is always open if you need anything." It was a polite offer, but it was also a clear warning. Trouble was coming. As true darkness fell, a third visitor arrived. This one was different. Grace Morgan was a widow who ran the small ranch next to Malcolm's. She came not with judgment, but with a loaf of fresh bread and a warm, genuine smile. "Thought you might appreciate something homemade after such a long journey," she said, handing the still warm loaf to Ellie. "That's very kind of you." Grace looked at Ellie with open curiosity, but no malice. "Takes a whole lot of courage to start over in a place like this. I hope you find what you're looking for." Later that night, while Malcolm was finishing his chores in the barn, Ellie stepped out onto the modified porch. The air was cold and clean. In the fading twilight, she could see the dark shapes of cattle grazing in the distant pastures. Even from this far away, something felt wrong. The way they moved. A few of them had a slow, listless gait that sent a chill down her spine. A gait she recognized with sickening clarity. Her hand instinctively went to the leather satchel she had kept by her side since Philadelphia. Inside that bag was knowledge. Knowledge passed down from her father. Knowledge in the form of instruments and remedies. Knowledge that could save this ranch or get her run out of town on a rail. Malcolm returned from the barn, his huge silhouette cutting a hole in the starry sky. He found her standing there, staring out at the land that held both of their futures. "The cattle," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at her. "How long have they been sick?" His face was a mask of shock in the dim lamplight from the window. "What makes you think they're sick?" The mistake hit her the second the words left her mouth. A seamstress from Philadelphia. What would she know about cattle? I I just noticed some of them are moving strangely," she stammered. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face. For a long moment the silence stretched between them, tight as a wire. She thought he was going to press her, to demand an answer she couldn't give. Instead he just sighed, the sound heavy with defeat. "Been losing them for months," he said, his gaze drifting back to the dark pastures. "Can't figure out what's wrong." Ellie's hand twitched, wanting to reach for her satchel. She stopped herself. The choice was right in front of her, stark and terrible. Stay silent, play the part of the helpless city woman, and watch this man's entire life crumble into dust around her. Or reveal the truth of who she really was and risk everything. The next morning, Malcolm took her out to the pastures. Up close, it was worse, so much worse. The cattle stood with their heads hanging low, their breathing shallow and ragged. A few had given up on eating entirely, their ribs showing through their hides. The signs were all there, a clear and terrifying story that only she could read. "Doc Miller came out last month," Malcolm said, his voice flat. He kicked at a clump of dry grass. "Said it was some kind of lung fever. Said there was nothing to be done. Just prepare to lose the herd." Ellie watched a small calf stumble, struggling to keep up with its mother. The sight of it, so weak and helpless, broke something inside her. She could hear her father's voice in her head, as clear as if he were standing right next to her. "Knowledge unused is a sin, Eleanor." She turned to Malcolm. "What exactly did Doc Miller diagnose?" Malcolm shrugged his massive shoulders. "Just lung fever. Said it had to run its course." The words were like a slap in the face. It wasn't just a wrong diagnosis. It was lazy. It was incompetent. These animals were dying for nothing. "Malcolm!" Her voice came out sharp, cutting through the morning air. "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her. In his dark eyes she saw her own reflection. A small black woman in a traveling dress who was supposed to know about needles and thread, not sickness and death. She took a deep breath. The secret she had carried for 1,000 miles was about to come out. My father wasn't just a man in Philadelphia, she said, her voice gaining strength. He was Dr. James Green. The name meant nothing to him, but she pushed on. He was one of the first colored veterinarians in the entire state of Pennsylvania, maybe the first in the country, and he taught me everything he knew. Malcolm's expression shifted, moving from confusion to disbelief, and then finally to a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. You're telling me you know about animal medicine? I'm telling you, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Your cattle do not have lung fever. They have parasitic bronchitis, and it's completely treatable. Without waiting for him to respond, she walked over to the nearest sick animal, a young bull that barely had the strength to lift its head. Her hands moved with a swift, practiced confidence that felt alien in her fine dress. She checked its gums, listened to the rasp of its breathing, peered into its dull eyes. See this? She said, her voice now crisp and clinical. The breathing is shallow, but it's rapid. See how his ribs show, even with plenty of grass? Classic signs of lungworm? Malcolm just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Doc Miller. He never said anything about parasites. Doc Miller, Ellie snapped, the anger she'd been suppressing finally boiling over. Probably learned everything he knows from a farmer's almanac. These animals don't need folk remedies. They need medicine. She marched back to the house and returned with the worn leather satchel. She knelt in the dirt and opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, were surgical tools her father had made with his own hands. Vials of chemical compounds she had mixed herself before leaving Philadelphia. Syringes, slides, a small microscope. Malcolm watched in stunned silence as she laid out the instruments of a life she was supposed to have left behind. How long have you known? He asked, his voice a quiet rumble. Since the moment I saw them yesterday evening, she admitted. I was afraid to say anything. Afraid of what? She looked up from her work and met his eyes. Afraid that in a place like this, a woman who knows too much might not be welcome. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. A woman with knowledge was a threat. A black woman with knowledge was a bigger one. It was a dangerous combination in a world that demanded everyone know their place. He looked from her determined face to his dying cattle, then back again. What do you need? He asked. The simple trust in those 4 words almost broke her. Help me catch them, she said, her voice thick with emotion, and trust that I know what I'm doing. They worked all morning. Malcolm, with his brute strength, would hold the sick animals steady. Ellie, with her small, skilled hands, would administer the treatments. It was a strange dance of power and precision. By the afternoon, they had visitors. Word travels fast in a place where there's nothing else to do. Grace Morgan rode up first, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. She was followed by Tom Peterson, a neighboring rancher with a face like a clenched fist. Even Sheriff Matz rode out, his expression carefully neutral. Heard there was some doctoring going on, Peterson said, spitting a wad of tobacco near Ellie's boots. Grace just watched, fascinated as Ellie finished treating a heifer. Good heavens, child, where did you learn to do all that? From my father, Ellie said, offering no more. Sheriff Matz dismounted and walked closer. These treatments, Mrs. Green, he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. This something Doc Miller recommended? Doc Miller diagnosed lung fever, Malcolm answered for her, his voice flat. Ellie thinks it's something else. Peterson let out a short, ugly laugh. And what would a seamstress from back east know about cattle sickness? Ellie straightened up from her work. She was tiny next to these weathered men, a doll in a world of giants. But when she spoke, her voice had the hard certainty of steel. I know, she said, looking Peterson right in the eye, that these animals will show improvement within 48 hours. I know that the medicine I've given them will kill the parasites Doc Miller was too ignorant to look for. And I know that this herd will not only survive, it will thrive. A dead silence fell over the group. That's a mighty big claim, Peterson finally grumbled. Yes, Ellie said. It is. The men eventually rode off, muttering amongst themselves. Only Grace stayed behind, helping Ellie clean her instruments. Your father must have been an amazing man, Grace said quietly. He was the best man I ever knew, Ellie replied. And he taught you all this? Ellie nodded, carefully wiping down a syringe. He used to say knowledge was the one thing in this world nobody could ever take from you, even when they take everything else. 2 days later, the sun wasn't even up yet. Malcolm found Ellie in the kitchen, staring out the window at the pastures. In the pale pre-dawn light, they could see them. The cattle. They were moving, grazing. Animals that had been on the verge of death 2 days ago were now on their feet, eating as if they were starved. It's working, Malcolm whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. He put a massive hand on her shoulder. My God, Ellie, it's working. By the end of the week, it wasn't just working. It was a miracle. The herd was transformed, healthy, alert, and gaining weight. The news ripped through Copper Valley like a prairie fire. Some ranchers came by, hats in hand, quietly asking for advice about their own sick animals. But others came with suspicion in their eyes. Mrs. Brickwood rode up one afternoon, flanked by her two cronies. They sat on their horses, staring at the healthy cattle with sour, disapproving faces. Quite the recovery, Mrs. Brickwood said, her voice sharp. One has to wonder where a simple seamstress acquired such unusual skills. One has to wonder why it matters, Malcolm shot back, stepping in front of Ellie, as long as the animals are healthy. Mrs. Brickwood's thin lips tightened into a cruel smile. Oh, it matters, Mr. Everett, she said, her voice dropping to a near hiss. In a proper, God-fearing community, it matters a great deal. The whispers started before the sun was up on Monday. Mrs. Brickwood had spent her weekend planting seeds of poison all over Copper Valley. By the time Ellie and Malcolm went to the general store for supplies, the whispers had grown into a hostile murmur. Conversation stopped the moment she walked in. People turned their backs. The storekeeper's wife served her with hands that trembled with reluctance, refusing to meet her eyes. Ain't natural, someone muttered from behind a stack of flour sacks. For a woman to know such things, especially that kind of woman. Malcolm's whole body went rigid, but Ellie put a hand on his arm, a silent plea to let it go. She had expected this. Her father had faced worse, and he was a respected doctor in a civilized city. The first real test came that afternoon. Grace Morgan rode up, but she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was Tom Peterson, the skeptical rancher, his hat now clutched nervously in his hands. Tom's got a sick horse, Ellie, Grace said, getting straight to the point. Been off her feed for days. Doc Miller came by, took his money and said there was nothing to be done. Peterson wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the dirt, the picture of a man forced to swallow his pride. Grace here. She said you might take a look. Ellie went with him. The mare was in a bad way, dehydrated and listless. The signs were obvious to her. Colic. Another simple diagnosis that the so-called doctor had completely missed. She needs mineral oil now, Ellie commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. And she needs to be walked every hour for the next 6 hours. I'll prepare an herbal mash. If you do exactly as I say, she'll live. If you don't, she'll be dead by morning. Peterson, desperate, did exactly as he was told. The horse made a full recovery. Now the news spread even faster. Within a week, Ellie was the busiest person in Copper Valley. A dairy cow with mastitis, a flock of sheep with foot rot, a prize bull that had lost its vigor. Each case was a puzzle Doc Miller had failed to solve, and each success was another nail in his coffin. But every animal she saved also fueled the fire of Mrs. Brickwood's crusade. The woman was relentless. She held teas for the concerned ladies of the valley, filling their heads with talk of witchcraft and unnatural practices. She paid a visit to the preacher, whispering about the dark forces invading their community. She wrote letters to the territorial authorities, warning of an unlicensed woman performing dangerous experiments on their livestock. The situation was a powder keg, waiting for a spark, and that spark arrived on the back of a $1,000 stallion. Thomas Caldwell. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, a man whose wealth was matched only by his influence. He rode up to Malcolm's ranch as if he owned it too. Everett, he said, swinging down from his horse, I hear you've got yourself a miracle worker. Ellie knows her business, Malcolm said, his voice tense. Caldwell ignored him. His cold, calculating eyes were fixed on Ellie. I've got a problem, he said. A big one. I've lost 40 head of cattle this season. Doc Miller's remedies are worthless. My foreman says you're the real deal. Maybe you should ask her to take a look, Malcolm said. Oh, I'm here to do more than that, Caldwell said with a smirk. He turned his full attention to Ellie, his voice dropping. I'll pay you $50 a month, plus room and board at my main house. You'll be in charge of the health of my entire herd, all 5,000 head. The offer was a thunderclap. $50 a month was more than most men in the territory made in a year. It was a fortune. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Caldwell, Ellie said, her voice even, but I'm happy where I am. Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Think about it. A woman with your particular talents. You could have a very comfortable life, much better than playing house on this dusty, failing ranch. Before Ellie could answer, Malcolm stepped forward. He moved between them, his massive frame completely eclipsing Caldwell. The air crackled with tension. She gave you her answer, Malcolm growled. Caldwell's smirk turned into a sneer. He looked from Malcolm's furious face to Ellie's calm one. Of course, he said. Just wanted to make sure she understood all her options. He mounted his horse and rode away. But Ellie knew this wasn't over. She had just refused the most powerful man in the valley, and he was not a man who took no for an answer. After Caldwell's visit, the attacks became brutal. Mrs. Brickwood's whispers turned into open accusations. Backed by Caldwell's money and influence, she called for a town meeting. The notice nailed to the door of the church was blunt: to address the unnatural situation at the Everett Ranch. The entire valley showed up. The small church was packed to the rafters: ranchers, storekeepers, wives, and children. Mrs. Brickwood had whipped them into a frenzy of fear and suspicion. She stood at the pulpit, her face flushed with righteous fury. We have a sacred duty, she cried, her voice ringing through the silent church. A duty to uphold the moral standards of this community. When unqualified individuals perform acts of medicine, they endanger us all. A murmur of agreement rippled through the pews. We are dealing with forces beyond our comprehension. Practices that have no place in a decent Christian town. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear as a bell. Witchcraft. Sheriff Matt sat in the back, his face unreadable. Grace Morgan sat near the front, her jaw set in a line of pure defiance. I propose, Mrs. Brickwood declared, going in for the kill, that we petition the territorial government to have this woman removed from our valley for the safety of us all. What safety are you talking about? Grace Morgan was on her feet, her voice cutting through the tension. The safety of our animals? The safety of our livelihoods? Ellie Green has saved more livestock in a month than Doc Miller has in a decade. Mrs. Morgan, you will hold your tongue. I will not, Grace shot back. My place is to stand up for what's right, Agnes. And you are wrong. Tom Peterson, the man whose horse Ellie had saved, stood up awkwardly. My mare would be dead if it weren't for her, he mumbled. A few other ranchers nodded in agreement, but Mrs. Brickwood was prepared. These so-called healings prove nothing, she shrieked. It is a trick, a devil's bargain that will lead us all to ruin. Finally, Sheriff Matt stood up. The room fell instantly silent. His presence commanded respect. That's enough, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the law. I've heard plenty of accusations tonight. Now I'd like to hear a single fact. His eyes found Ellie in the crowd. Mrs. Green, would you care to tell us exactly what it is you do? Every head in the church turned. Every eye was on her. This was it, the moment she had been running from. She stood up and walked to the front of the church. She felt small, exposed, 1,000 miles from home. She took a deep breath. My father, she began, her voice clear and steady, was Dr. James Green. He held a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Pennsylvania. He taught me anatomy. He taught me pharmacology. He taught me diagnostic procedure. He taught me the scientific method. She looked directly at Mrs. Brickwood. What you call unnatural is called science. The parasites that were killing Mr. Everett's cattle are real. They can be seen under a microscope. The medicine I used is a chemical compound, not a magic potion. The colic that was killing Mr. Peterson's horse is a physical ailment, not a curse. She turned her gaze to the rest of the crowd, her voice rising with passion. You live in a world of mystery and fear because you choose to, because it's easier to believe in devils than it is to learn about disease. I use the same principles any trained doctor would use. The only difference, she said, her voice dropping but losing none of its power, is that my skin is dark and I am a woman. The church was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Mrs. Brickwood's face was pale, her mouth hanging open. Sheriff Matz nodded slowly. Sounds like proper training to me, he said. And far as I can tell, there's no law against being smart. But, but the territorial authorities, Mrs. Brickwood stammered. Maybe they should look into it, Matz agreed. But until they do, Mrs. Green has every right to help her neighbors. Meeting's over. The meeting broke up in a chaos of arguments and confused glances. Ellie had won the battle. She had faced them down with logic and truth. But as she and Malcolm walked out of the church into the cold night air, she knew the war was far from over. She had humiliated the most powerful people in the valley, and they would never forgive her. The snow came 2 weeks later. It didn't just fall, it attacked. A furious, howling blizzard that descended from the mountains like an invading army. Within hours, the world was gone, erased by a wall of white. Malcolm stood at the window, his face grim. Never seen one come on this fast, this hard. Ellie stood beside him. Everything she knew about weather told her this wasn't a storm. It was a killer. The cattle, she started. Move them to the lower pasture, near the windbreaks, he said. But if this keeps up, he didn't need to finish. A storm like this could wipe out every ranch in the valley. It was an economic apocalypse, a white plague that could destroy them all. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped into the single digits, then below zero. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous drifts. The first cry for help came just before dawn. It was Tom Peterson, his face a mask of frozen terror, his horse stumbling from exhaustion. Lost 12 head already, he screamed over the gale. Froze solid where they stood. The rest are scattered in the north pasture. I can't get to them. Ellie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag and her heaviest coat. You can't go out in this, Malcolm said, grabbing her arm. Those animals will die, she shot back, her eyes blazing. Hypothermia isn't a death sentence if you treat it in time, but we have to go now. They rode out into the hurricane of snow. It was like riding into nothingness. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The wind ripped at them, driving ice crystals into their faces like tiny needles. They found Peterson's cattle huddled behind a rock outcropping, their coats thick with ice. Several were already down, motionless lumps in the deep snow. Ellie was off her horse before it even stopped, plunging into a snowdrift up to her waist. This one's alive, she yelled, her gloved hands finding the faint, shallow breath of a young bull. Help me get him up. She was a whirlwind of motion in the frozen chaos. She checked each fallen animal, her hands moving with an efficiency that defied the brutal cold. 3 more were alive, but just barely. We have to warm their core temperature, she shouted to the men, but slowly. Too fast and the shock will kill them. She used techniques her father had taught her for surviving the brutal winters of the North. She administered stimulants from her bag. She directed the men to rub the animals' limbs to get the blood moving. They wrapped the weakest ones in horse blankets, creating makeshift shelters against the relentless wind. As they worked, another rider appeared out of the whiteout. It was Grace Morgan. The Hendersons are wiped out, she cried, her voice cracking. Their whole dairy herd, 23 animals, gone. The news was a gut punch. More desperate reports followed. The Caldwells had 100 head trapped in a box canyon. Someone else's sheep were lost on the open range. And Doc Miller? He had locked himself in his office in town, declaring the situation hopeless. That's when Ellie made the decision. She stood up in the middle of the blizzard, the wind tearing at her, and looked at the terrified faces around her. We are going to help every single person we can reach, she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. Every animal we save is a family that survives. Malcolm stared at her, his face caked in ice. Ellie, that could mean riding for days. We could die out here. Then we'll die helping, she said. For the next 72 hours, they didn't stop. They became ghosts in the storm, moving from one desperate ranch to the next. The blizzard raged, but they raged harder. Ellie treated frostbite, hypothermia, snow blindness. Her supplies ran low, so she improvised, using whatever she could find. Hot mash, whiskey, turpentine rubs. At the Caldwell Ranch, they found a scene of chaos. Thomas Caldwell himself was in the middle of it, his expensive coat torn, his hands raw and bleeding, working alongside his men to free the cattle trapped in the canyon. He looked up, stunned, as Ellie rode in with her medical bag. "Didn't expect to see you," he grunted. "The cattle don't care that we don't like each other," she replied, already dismounting and getting to work. For 6 hours straight, she worked on his animals, showing them the same care and expertise she'd shown everyone else. When the last calf was pulled from the snow-filled canyon, Caldwell cornered her by the fire. He looked at his saved herd, then at her exhausted, ice-covered face. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice quiet. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," she said, turning away. "Your cattle needed help." But then came the biggest shock of the storm. On the third day, as they were riding to the Morrison place, they found a horse wandering alone, its reins trailing in the snow. 100 yards away, half buried in a drift, was a man. It was Doc Miller. His wagon had overturned. He'd tried to make it to a sick child in an outlying cabin and had gotten lost in the whiteout. He was nearly frozen solid, his breathing faint and shallow. Without a word, Ellie went to work. She used the last of her precious stimulants on him. She and Malcolm built a fire and slowly, carefully, began to warm him, saving the life of the very man who had called her a fraud and a charlatan. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the world was a strange and silent landscape of white. Sheriff Matz rode out, checking on the survivors. He found Ellie and Malcolm at the Morrison Ranch, treating the last of the critical cases. "Heard you two have been making the rounds," Matt said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "Someone had to," Malcolm replied simply. "Doc Miller was telling everyone we'd lose more than half the livestock in the valley," the sheriff said, looking at the recovering animals. "The early counts are coming in. We lost less than 20%. He looked directly at Ellie. "That's not a manageable loss. That's a miracle. You saved this valley, Mrs. Green." The numbers were just part of the story. The real story was in the faces of the ranchers. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a deep, humbling gratitude. Grace Morgan organized a community gathering, not to cast judgment, but to give thanks. The church was packed again, but this time, the mood was entirely different. One by one, ranchers stood up and told the story of how Ellie and Malcolm had saved them. Thomas Caldwell was the last to speak. He stood before the whole town and publicly thanked her, admitting he had been a fool. Even Mrs. Brickwood was there. She didn't speak to the crowd, but she found Ellie afterward. "I let fear and prejudice guide me," she said, her voice stiff but sincere. "I was wrong. Thank you." Ellie had done it. She had faced down the prejudice, the ignorance, the hatred. She had won her place not with words but with action. She had the respect of the community. She had the love of a good man. Everything she had fought for was finally hers. They arrived back at the ranch, exhausted but triumphant, to find a letter waiting for them. It had a Philadelphia postmark, and it was about to tear her new world apart. The letter lay on the kitchen table, a small white rectangle that held the power of a bomb. Ellie recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and a cold dread washed over her. Malcolm saw the look on her face. "Bad news?" "I don't know," she whispered. She took the letter into their bedroom to read it alone. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. It was from Dr. Harrison Webb, her father's oldest friend and colleague from the University of Pennsylvania. The words on the page seemed to swim before her eyes. Her father's life's work, his extensive research notes, his revolutionary clinical studies, was being used to establish the first official college of veterinary medicine in the entire country. They were building his dream, and they wanted her to come home, not just to visit. They wanted her to help write the curriculum, to be a founding instructor, to take her father's place and shape the future of the science he had dedicated his life to. It wasn't an offer, it was a calling. a chance to become one of the first officially licensed female veterinarians in America, to have the degrees, the credentials, the respect her father had fought for but never fully achieved. It was everything she had ever wanted, before she even knew what she wanted. Malcolm found her an hour later, sitting on the edge of the bed, the letter clutched in her hand. "Ellie?" She just handed it to him. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed. When he finished, he looked not at her, but out the window, at the healthy cattle grazing in the field she had saved. "This is important," he finally said. "It was his whole life," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Malcolm turned to face her, his expression grim but resolute. "Then you have to go." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. "Leave?" she cried. "Leave you? Leave this?" "Ellie, look at what this is," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is bigger than us. This is bigger than Copper Valley. You could change everything, for the whole country." "And what about what we've built here?" she asked, the tears now streaming down her face. "What we've built is here to stay," he said, his voice thick with a pain he was trying to hide. "But an opportunity like that, it won't wait." The news spread through the valley, as news always did. This time there was no suspicion, only a quiet, sad acceptance. Grace Morgan came by with a heavy heart. "We need you, Ellie," she said, taking her hands. "But the world needs you more. Your father would be so proud." Then Sheriff Matz arrived with a complication. "I've been writing to the territorial governor," he said, getting straight to the point. "Told him what you did during the storm. Told him we need a professional overseeing the health of our livestock. Not just for the valley, for the whole territory." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They've authorized the position, an official territorial veterinarian, with a salary and government authority. And the job is yours, Ellie, if you want it." It was a staggering offer. Legitimacy, stability, a permanent, respected place in the home she had fought so hard for. A life with Malcolm. But it wasn't Philadelphia. It wasn't her father's legacy. The town threw a dinner for her, a farewell just in case. The entire valley came. Tom Peterson made a clumsy, heartfelt speech. Thomas Caldwell shook her hand and asked her to send him research papers from the East. Even Mrs. Brickwood came to her, her old animosity replaced by a quiet respect. "Do what's best for your future, child," she said, "but know you'll always have a home here." The final, most difficult conversation happened on a Sunday morning. She and Malcolm stood on the porch, looking out over the ranch. Their ranch. "You've made a decision," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. "It's Philadelphia." She finally looked at him, her heart breaking. "I have to. For him." "I know," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "But I don't want to lose this," she sobbed. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he said, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. "Distance can't change what we've built." They stood there for a long time, holding on to each other. Then an idea began to form in Ellie's mind. A crazy, impossible idea. "There might be a way," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. He pulled back, looking down at her. "What way?" "The college," she said, the plan coming together as she spoke. "It will take them 6 months, maybe a year, to get the curriculum established and the first classes started. But after that, they'll need to test their methods, in the field, in new environments." Hope flickered in Malcolm's eyes. "You're talking about coming back." "I'm talking," she said, a smile finally breaking through her tears, "about having both. 6 months a year in Philadelphia, building my father's legacy, and 6 months a year here, in Wyoming, building ours. And I could come to Philadelphia," he added, catching her excitement, "learn about the new farming techniques they're using back east." It wasn't a compromise, it was a new kind of partnership, a bridge between two worlds, a future bigger and bolder than either of them had ever dreamed of alone. That night she wrote 2 letters, one to Philadelphia, accepting their offer on her own terms, the other to the governor, accepting the position of territorial veterinarian, also on her own terms. The letters would go out on the next stagecoach, setting in motion a future no one could have predicted. A year later, that same stagecoach rolled to a stop in Copper Valley. But this time, the whole town was waiting. Malcolm stood at the front of the crowd, his giant frame shaking with anticipation. The coach door opened, and Dr. Eleanor Green stepped out. She wore a fine new dress, but she also carried a new leather medical bag, and in her satchel were official documents from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, certifying her as a licensed doctor of veterinary medicine. Sheriff Matz, now a territorial marshal, tipped his hat. "Dr. Green," he said with a grin, "welcome home." The title felt right. She had earned it. The celebration lasted for 2 days. The woman who had arrived as a frightened, unwanted stranger was now the guest of honor, the hero of the entire territory. 2 weeks later, they were married in the same church where she had once been put on trial. The minister's words echoed through the joyful crowd. "We are here to celebrate two people who have shown us that love is not about forcing two lives to fit together. It's about building a new life, big enough for both of their dreams." When Malcolm spoke his vows, he looked into her eyes and said, with a smile the whole town understood, "I'll make it fit." Their story became a legend in the West. The brilliant black doctor from the East and the giant rancher from the frontier. They spent half the year in Philadelphia, where Dr. Green became a celebrated professor and researcher. The other half they spent in Wyoming, where their ranch became a model of modern agriculture, a beacon of progress for the entire territory. They built a bridge between two worlds, proving that the things that make us different don't have to divide us. Sometimes they're the very things that make us strong enough to change the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. And let us know in the comments, what's the biggest obstacle you've ever overcome? We might just turn it into our next story.